Okay, today is February 2nd, 2023. My name is Gina Matos, and I'm with the Houston Asian American Archive interviewing Joseph Bowie. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to participate in an interview with us.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Okay, we can go ahead and get started with some questions about your early life. So, the first question, if you can tell us when and where were you born?
Yeah. So I was born here in Houston, Texas, specifically in Alief. Um, yeah, in 1999 of October 17th. And and I've lived here for most of my life, and then for college I went somewhere else in Maine for college.
So, you primarily grew up in Houston, Texas, correct?
Yeah, pretty much like all my life. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So, as many people know, Houston is one of the most diverse cities in the country. So, what was it like growing up in Houston, Texas, or even more specifically, growing up as a Vietnamese American in Houston?
Yeah. So as a Vietnamese American in Houston, I think it was definitely, especially in the Alief side, I think it's considered as most diverse in Houston. Um, so there's like a big like Vietnamese population here. And I'm like living very close to the Bel Air Chinatown, which I frequent often with like family and friends and just for good times. Um, but growing up here, it's been I think a good experience in terms of like diversity. When I went to college in Maine, it was like a big culture shock, especially like in the New England area. Um, but I think for sure, definitely in high school, there was like a large Asian population. It's definitely at my school, at Kerr High School, which was like a significant amount of Asians were there and attending there. And it gave me a good sense of like who I was as a Asian American, um, with like this community where um, we're all frequent with each other, more of a sense of how different I was compared to other people, and a sense of that label of like being an Asian American and what that meant to me.
Yeah, I can totally relate. I grew up in Houston as well, and I would say that it was a very um, great place for me to really get a sense of my own ethnic identity as well. Um, Moving on to the next question. Who are your parents? What were your parents' occupations? And if any way, how did it influence your upbringing?
Yeah. So my parents, let's see, my dad works as a caregiver for my grandparents. But he is also like a general handyman overall for like the whole family. Like there's like nothing he can't fix, from washing machines to things out in the garden, anything around the house really. So he's a big guy about fixing things and fixing up things for our parents, but also like a general caregiver. He was almost like a stay-at-home dad, in a sense, when I was younger. Um, and my mother, she works as a hairstylist or a hair cutter. She's a small business owner and she's been cutting hair ever since, and she owns like a small salon near Westheimer. But yeah, those are my parents.
Awesome. You mentioned in your survey that you grew up with first generation parents. What was that experience like? Were there ever any cultural differences and or clashes between you and your parents growing up?
Yeah, I think coming here, they had a sense of like preserving their Vietnamese identity and like the culture that they grew up in. But at the same time, I think they had a sense of taking in the American way and kind of incorporating that into their own identity and like learning to survive and adapt in a way. Um, and in some sense, they kind of brought that upon us too. I would like to say, like, compared to other Asian families, I think mine's is definitely like kind of more lenient. Like they allowed me and my sister to kind of not do whatever we want, but we had like more freedom in terms of like staying out a bit later than most, Asian kids where they had like curfews and things like that. But my parents were like more free in that aspect, but they were strict on some things, and I think it just took some times because I would remember arguing with my parents where like um over like certain ways of like how other American kids would do things, but my parents would be a bit more strict about that. Like sleepovers, like everyone would be going to sleepovers, and my parents were like, no, you can't sleep at someone else's house, you know. What happened if it gets caught on fire and it burns down? It's like their fault. And I was just like, I'm like, that's a very crazy coincidence if it were to happen. But yeah, my parents were very conservative about like that idea and like some of the other aspects of being American.
Yeah, and that perfectly segues into my next question. What values were instilled in you or emphasized growing up? I know you just touched a little bit on this, but if you could expand on that.
Sorry, could you repeat the question one more time? I think you were like cutting off.
Yeah, of course. I apologize. I was gonna ask, what values were instilled in you and or emphasized growing up, and that I know that you touched on it a bit, but if you could expand on it a little bit.
Yeah, I guess like some of the values that like my parents kind of taught me, or definitely like, you know, like your typical Asian stereotypes, like study hard, like don't focus too much on your relationships with other people, um, you know, sleep well, eat well. Um, but I think the main aspect is just stuff like working hard so you can, you know, eventually later on in life be rich, be very frugal with your money and like invest your time in things that, you know, are like an investment and like would grow into other things. Such as like my parents would tell me like, you know, try to join as many clubs as you can, and just like invest your time into like a hobby or something that you really want to do and really invest into something so like it would come out greater in the end. Um, but I think like looking back now from when I was a kid, I think some of the things that definitely stuck on was like, you know, working hard and, you know, never, if you're gonna pursue something, never give up on it. Um, and definitely just that aspect.
You touched on this too a little bit, but did your family practice any particular Vietnamese traditions growing up?
Yeah, I think there's like a couple traditions that we still do. Like just this past January was Tet or like Lunar New Year's for a lot of cultures. So we still celebrate that with the passing of the red envelopes, the Ao Dai, which is like the garment, as well as what we usually do is just like have like a nice big family dinner with everyone in our family, exchange blessings, and then receive the red envelope, and really just like catch up with the whole family and things like that. Um, let's see, in terms of other aspects, uh, I'm not quite too sure. Like we still go to Vietnamese mass every Sunday. Um, being Catholic. What else? It's let's see. I think significantly I've been just like kind of watching my family in terms of like in times of mourning since like our grandfather passed away like last January from COVID, and just like watching how Vietnamese Catholic members of the church would celebrate death and that passing. So I've been kind of like watching them in that aspect. Um, but in terms of other traditions, um yeah, I think Lunar New Year's was like the ones that was most recent and you know, just like cleaning up the house, visiting family and passing blessings. Um and I guess also like food because like I think that's a big aspect of like my Vietnamese experience like food, the exchange of food and how like it's like a way of bringing people together of like who cooks what dishes and like who cooks it better and then the gossip that goes around and how to cook it better. Because like a lot of people in my family on both sides, my mom and dad's, either own restaurants or things like that, or they're just like fantastic cooks. But yeah.
So I'm curious, um, being older now, do you have a more conscious appreciation of Vietnamese and or Vietnamese American culture that was that you grew up with?
Yeah, I think I think especially now, with my art, or photography, is like really focusing on like my family's life, specifically my mom and dad, but also I'm trying to expand it to my extended family. Really focusing on like preserving that Vietnamese identity, which I feel like I have a disconnect with. Growing up here in America, like you get exposed to American ways, um, but especially like during my time in high school where it was like other Asians, it was more Americanized than Asian. And it was like I think I haven't been exposed to that Vietnamese aspect and culture as much as I thought I had would have, compared to like other students, especially in college. I met up with some international students from Vietnam, and they would kind of tell me about like their lives back in Vietnam, and then compare that to me, which is like a Vietnamese American. And they were like, "Oh, do you still have this here?" Which is like, like these certain types of foods, also celebrations. And I'm like, "Oh, I heard of like, Lunar New Year's, but I haven't heard about this celebration and this celebration." So there was like a disconnect between, Vietnamese born students there versus me as like a Vietnamese American student. So there was like that disconnect. And I'm like trying to reconnect with my parents in terms of like what they went through coming here, the Vietnamese diaspora. Um, and that aspect. So like trying to find ways to preserve like my family, my mom and dad, and their traditions. Yeah.
Yeah, we will definitely go more into your art later, specifically the projects surrounding your family. But I just have a few more questions about your early life and education. Um,
Yeah.
so you also mentioned that you have one sibling. Do you have any memorable stories you would like to share?
Yeah. Well, I guess let's see. So my sister, her name is Tiffany Bowie, and she's only like a year under me right now. Um, right now, I mean all her life. But yeah, let's see, a memorable memory. Let's see, when we were younger, our grandma would like watch over me and my sister, and my mom and dad would be like at work, and we would just play, like dolls and like make believe with each other. Um, and then let's see. I know we would bicker a lot as, like brothers and sisters do. And eventually as we got older, we kind of like learned to tolerate each other. And I think let's see, a very distinct memory is like do you know what the Nintendo Wii is?
Of course,
Okay, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And so they have the game called Wii Sports, and I think I would be a big fan of baseball. And she would one time she sat right in front of me when I was like pitching, and I kind of whacked her really hard with the Wii remote. So that was like a pretty core memory. And I was like, oh gosh, did I cause like any brain damage? It's kind of concerning. But yeah, that's a pretty core memory, I think. It's like kind of funny when I think about it, but she was like breaking out crying. Um but yeah, I think having my sister around is definitely like, she was there to like kind of witness like some of the events that me and her went through with our family, in terms of like celebrations, traveling. And yeah, I think we turned out to be good kids, I hope.
Did you have any notable mentors in your life? It can be artistic mentors or any mentors in general.
Yeah. Let's see. In I guess like my earliest mentors were in high school that I think made a really early impact on me. Um, in high school, I had a band director by the name of Ashley Segrist. Um, she was like a very motivated teacher who would like go above and beyond like her pay grade. By that fact of like, teachers don't get paid a lot. Because she would like stay after school a lot and work after hours in terms of like preparing curriculum and also like connecting with band members. Um, but she will also go above and beyond like connecting with students, like learning about their families and how she can help out. um and also her idea of the classroom and kind of like what band represents, like I remember the first day of class she told me, I don't care if you're a bad musician, But if you show motivation and like the drive to practice and work hard, then in my eyes, you're already a good student, no matter how bad you play. And I think I like that ideal in terms of like, it shows that this person has drive and things like that. And she really stuck on me in terms of like how she connected with other students and how she motivated the band to be, um, the best person they are. Like, if anything, she wasn't raising musicians, she was just raising, better people in life in general. And she was always very supportive of students, of like, um, in terms of like their ambitions and things that they wanted to do. But she would also like help out in life in general. Like I think one time, a story she would tell me is like one of her older students would call her when her car broke down, and she was like, "Help me, Seegers, I don't know what to do. Like, who do I call?" And she would like tell them to calm down and break down what to do. Um, with another student, like they were struggling with classes and didn't know how to catch up, and she would sit down with them and like break down of like a to-do list of like things to do in this order to catch up and pass. um but yeah, she was like one of the people that stuck on me, um from high school. And then my art teacher from high school also stuck on me pretty well in terms of like her ideals. I think she was considered Buddhist, but she had very strong ideas of like how to live your life. And um for classes she would show like TED Talks of like of what was it, of like people, of like mind-blowing ideas about life, those life talk videos. And she would I remember this one video she showed me. It was like how to live your life to the fullest or something like that. um and it was just like talking about, if you're going to pursue something, pursue it fully, wholeheartedly. And just like, those life things, like life is like a roller coaster, there'll be up and downs and things like that. But she was just a very open-minded teacher that took in my passion for art and knew how to push me to challenge myself with art and really pursue it. But yeah.
So going along the lines of talking about you developing your interest in the arts, what is your earliest memory of your interest in the arts and or photography?
Yeah. Let's see. When I was in kindergarten, um, we would practice writing, and I remember for every letter, I would add like little curlies at the end of everything. So like with the letter J, just like curling that, with the I, just like curling that. So like I think that was like an indicator that this guy thinks different. So they were just like, "Oh, Joseph, stop doing that. It just takes time away from like writing your story or like things like that." And it just makes it really hard to read low key. And I was just like, okay. um, and then I guess moving on to like grade school, like I would always like have a passion for like drawing, and I was like start tracing Pokemon and things like that. And then like arts and crafts, like people would ask me, "Oh, Joseph, can you draw me like a duck and things like that?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure." Um, and then I guess in high school, I pursued it a little bit further in terms of like what I want to do in the future. I remember like in my freshman year, I was like doing graphic design and learning Photoshop, and also like video editing. I remember spending a whole summer, by myself, just like watching YouTube tutorials of how to use Photoshop and like this movie maker program like Sony Vegas or something. And I got really good at it. And um, it was a time in my life that was like I was very passionate in learning how to do art really well. And I got really good at graphic design, but I really hated the fact where we had to go online and like buy stock photos in order to like Photoshop composite and things like that. So I was like, why don't I pick up a camera and try taking my own photographs? So I did that my sophomore year, and that's when I got really enticed into the camera. Like it was like a very awesome tool that captured the moment. And it was like very flexible in terms of like what you can do with it, like photograph people, landscape, nature, and things like that. So like every day during high school I would like bring people would know me as the camera guy because I would like carry a camera bag all over me. and just take photos of people, random things, and eventually, I had a role as like the photographer at my school. Like I wasn't in yearbook and anything, but I was like the band photographer, like photographing as a publicist. Um, but also, just like photographing people, my friends, and just like life's moments. And I eventually got really good at it in high school. And then I started charging people for like prom photos, graduation photos in high school. And I think my core memory about my artistic passion was like during prom season, I remember I was booked all day from like 9 a.m. till like the dance at prom, just like taking people's photos. But I made a lot of good money that day and I showed it to my parents and they're like, "Oh wow, this is like it could be your passion." But like most Asian parents, they don't really support the arts and, they still don't really today. But I try to prove it to them that, it can be sustainable and that, I'm working hard for it. But yeah.
So would you say that generally you taught yourself photography and that's where your passion stemmed from rather than taking classes prior to college?
Yeah, I think the classes prior to college definitely like motivated me to develop my photography practice. Like, it definitely taught me like the skill sets and also like technical, skills, like how to use Photoshop, what does this setting do in the camera. Um, but definitely for myself, it was definitely like finding things that I like to photograph that really developed my, I don't know, career, I guess. And finding things that I like to photograph eventually, and going to college, still learning about technical skills and things like that, but developing my artistic voice in that way. Yeah.
You briefly mentioned this, so we're gonna kind of go back to this. So did your family approve of your career choice at first? If you could expand on that.
Yeah. So I guess going back, let's see. I remember early in my life I told my parents I was gonna be an architect. And they're like, "Oh, that's cool, you like to draw buildings and things like that, and you're like a pretty decent artist, and you're pretty good at math, so maybe that will stem out." And then I scrapped that idea, and then I told them, "Oh, I'm gonna be a therapist because I like talking to people. I like helping people, like a clinical therapist." And they're like, "Oh, that's cool. Okay." And and then in high school, I told them like, "Oh, never mind. I'm gonna be a photographer." And they're like, "Oh, okay." Typical kids things, they're always changing their major or what they want to be. Um, so they were like just like kind of taking that to heart kind of like a lot because like when you say you're gonna do this, then stick with it. When I told them that I wanted to be a photographer like in high school and then I told them like that was what I was going to declare my major as in college. They're like, "Oh, okay, maybe have like a backup, we're kind of worried, like the starving artist concept and, you're not going to make that much money from photography." And so in college I took up psychology as my second major. Like hoping to do like a connection between art and therapy to do art therapy. And I was like, "Okay, I'll try to do a double major thing." That didn't really work out because like I took my first class of psychology and I was like, "Oh gosh, this is like a lot of research-based things." And I was like, I'm not there for the research-based things. I'm more into like clinical and like helping people. But I think in psychology, you have to go through that route to get to the other route. So I was like, gosh, that's probably not for me. So I decided to focus wholly or fully on photography. And yeah, when I told them that, they were like, "Oh, okay, we'll do our best to support you." And I was like, "Okay." And they're still on edge about it because like, they don't know. They grew up, thinking of taking jobs that would pay well, like being a doctor or a lawyer or like a businessman. Um, so they didn't push me in that aspect, but they just showed worry. Um, Compared to like other parents where my friends would tell me like their parents would like, "Oh, they really want me to be a doctor," and I don't want to do that. And I'm like, "Yeah, my parents don't really pressure me in that aspect. They just want me to do well in school and make a lot of money." So, I think right now I'm still trying to prove to my parents that I can be a successful photographer and artist in practice. And I hope so far all the career advance or my achievements like kind of prove that to them. Because I remember one time my mom saw my CV or like resume, and they're like, "Wow, I didn't know you did so many art things and got so many accomplishments." It's kind of eye opening because low key I don't really tell my parents any of my achievements because like I don't know, I didn't think they would care too much about it because it was like art related. Um, but now I like to share, every so often, like, oh, this is some new photographs I took for, this company. And yeah, they're like, you're making good money. And they're slowly accepting it once, the achievements start rolling in or something. Yeah.
No, looking at your resume, I'm sure they're thoroughly impressed, like really. So going back a bit, what influenced your decision to attend Colby College in Waterville, Maine?
Yeah. Do you know where Maine is? Just for starters.
I have a general idea of where Maine is on the map. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Because like most people when I tell like my families and friends like, oh, I go to Colby College in Maine, they're like, where's Maine? And I'm like, oh, Canada. I'll tell you Canada. And they're like, oh, international. I'm like, no. It's just like the very top, never eat, northeast of the US. And it's very close to Canada, like literally touching it. Um, but I guess to answer your question, so in high school, I applied for a scholarship program called Posse, the Posse Foundation Scholarship, which is a full, not a full ride, like a full tuition-based scholarship that is merit-based for individuals who showed like exceptional leadership and could carve the future. Um, that's like very glamorous and everything, but th- I I applied for that during my high school year, seeing that my friends applied for it as well, and they were like very exceptional leaders. And I thought, why not, try to get a scholarship because I didn't want to burden my family with like money and debt and things like that. And I also wanted to go out of state because I wanted like a different experience of what I've experienced in Houston, which was kind of like a bubble for me because it was just like mainly me and my high school friends and like not really exploring like the greater Houston area. Um, so I applied for the Posse Foundation scholarship and I made it through all the rounds. I think it was like out of 40,000 or 4,000 applicants. Posse had like 60 schools. So, I mean, six schools that they were partnered with, and Colby was one of them. So only 60 students made it to their colleges or were selected for the college. And Posse chose me, specifically Colby College administrators chose me, and I was very grateful for that. And yeah, the school picked me out of all the schools, and I got to attend Colby College because of Posse. Yeah.
Wow, that's such an achievement with all the applicants applying for the scholarship. Wow.
Oh yeah.
So you graduated recently with a BA in studio art, particularly photography at Colby College. So what was your experience like as a photography major?
Yeah. Let's see. As a photography major at Colby College is a liberal arts college. Um, and I think their top like majors were like government, business, and I think CS, which is like computer science. Um, Me being a photographer there was definitely the art community there is like very small already. Um, and I think in my class, there was only like 10 or 12 students in my photography class. And then graduating year, there was only, I believe, like 12 of us with the art major. So it was like a very small community, but it was a very close community in that aspect of like uh we knew each other pretty well. We knew how to challenge each other and like push our artistic endeavors. So I was really happy in that aspect in terms of like going instead to like an art school where like everyone's an art major and you know it was a pretty eye-opening experience, especially going to Colby College because it was like a liberal arts school. So you had to take classes in psychology, science, math, and taking all these classes was definitely like eye-opening, even though I was just an art major and that's all I wanted to do. Um, but it was interesting to take, classes about logic, take classes about social science, social psychology, geology, and things like that. So, but I'm grateful for the experience that Kobe gave me in terms of like, internship opportunities. I got to design my own internship to go to Seattle and be like a photo intern that the whole curriculum I basically designed myself. Um, could have went abroad, but COVID hit. Um, but a lot of meaningful connections for sure.
Just curious, where would you have gone abroad if, COVID didn't strike?
Yeah, yeah. So if COVID didn't hit, I would have gone to Glasgow, which is near Scotland. Um, so yeah, I would have gone there for like their art school program. One of my friends did the previous year, and they made like artist books, and really learned how to handcraft it, like books in general, like sewing, types of paper, things like that. Yeah, I never knew there was so much that went into books in terms of like designing it and also making it. But yeah.
That's such a shame. We're gonna talk more about how the COVID pandemic affected your art and your major later. So did you participate in any other extracurriculars in college?
Yeah, so let's see. In college, I participated in gosh, I'm getting flashbacks from college. Let's see. I helped run the Kobe Photography Club, um, which was on hiatus for a bit, but then I came as a freshman with these other upperclassmen to self-start it up again. Um, helping with the POC community, which is the people of color community. There's this center called the Pew Center, which focuses on diversity and inclusion and equity, and just like really participating in all their events and like helping, photograph things, but also like helping my friends who ran it, programming there, so helping them, as well as gosh, there was like craft club. There was there were so many clubs that like I was like a participant in, but not really like running it. Um, but yeah, there was like outdoors club, which I find myself really enjoying like any water-based activities like kayaking, canoeing, things like that, camping. Yeah. I yeah, I think that's all I can think about on the top of my head.
So would you say that you're just a person who has a lot of different interests, and so that's why you're involved in so many extracurriculars? Or do you think that you pursue extracurriculars to find passions outside of your art? You know, or it can be a combination of the two.
Yeah. So I think for sure, like I think definitely one of the questions that run through my mind is definitely like, what do I do outside of photography? And I find myself like conflicted that I blend in my photography as like my personal and business life. And like I'm trying to find things that I do outside of photography and find passions in that. Um, but also in college, I was just trying to like make new friends in general. So I did all these extracurriculars that seemed fun, and I built some relationships with people and friends, and especially professors. They would join us in these activities and just trying to build meaningful connections in terms of like progressing work. Um, but yeah, I think that was mostly it. But yeah.
Awesome. So we're gonna now get into more of your career. I'm gonna start with some more specific questions about some of your recent artistic projects, and then from there, we'll move into more general questions about the specific ways that you approach your craft and your experience as an artist. Um, so you created the artistic project Queer Journey in college, in which you took portraits and photos, conducted interviews, and all in all recorded the narratives of the queer community in Waterville, Maine. Um, what was this experience like? What was your inspiration for this project? And what were some of the highlights and or challenges in the creation process?
Yeah. So I guess So that project started in 2021, I believe. We were invited back to college from COVID. And there was like very strict parameters in terms of like we could be on campus, but we couldn't go to classes, really mask mandate and also rigorous testing. We were tested like 3 times a week for COVID. And they also like had quarantine zones and things like that. So it was very it was like a hard time doing this project because like, people would like either like be getting COVID too busy or they just wanted, to isolate. Um, so that project started as like a class assignment where we were supposed to make a photo book about a project that we wanted to do. And with me, I wanted to do a project about the queer community on our campus, um, and really focus in on their narratives. I was inspired by this artist named Jim Goldberg and his project, which is called Rich and Poor, where he photographed like a poverty-stricken community, and also taking their narrative, where he would give them the power to like write down what they wanted to say about themselves, about their life and things like that, which accompanied with their portrait. So I wanted to do that same idea, but for the queer community, because I find it sometimes underrepresented, especially on my campus, but also focusing on the BIPOC community, people of color, um, because that's an even smaller community in our community. Because the college I went to was like predominantly white, and I wanted to make a statement of being Asian American and also queer, but also give the voice to other queer POC artists. So the process through that was like asking people would they be willing to interview with me, and also like having a short like photo shoot session. And um it was it was quite the endeavor because I would like dedicate a majority of my day interviewing people and also taking their portraits and sitting with them. And it was also eye-opening to me in terms of like learning how they grew up, their queer experience and things like that. um and I think in total there was 80 participants, I believe, somewhere around there in the book as well. Um, and it was really quite big, and I hope to do something similar like that in Texas, or I'm working on it for Houston. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, for sure. Um, so more recently, you touched on this earlier in the interview, but you artistically documented the story of your family in Houston, Texas, in a photo book and series, I Love You, I Miss You, Have a Good Day. So what was this experience like? What was your inspiration for this project? And again, what were some of the highlights and or challenges in the process?
Yeah. Let's see. I guess for a short introduction of what the project is, I love you, I miss you, have a good day is like a short phrase I would tell my mom before she left for work, like really quickly before she like ran out the door, which has sort of become like a prayer to me now. Hence also the title, which focuses on my parents and like my love for them, and this idea of like they're aging, eventually they'll pass away. So just like preserving uh their time with me and these little moments. Um this is especially relevant because I started that project when I was sent home because of the COVID pandemic. Because my school got shut down and they basically forced all students to leave campus and go home. And having came home, I had to do a project for my photo class, and I decided to document my family. Um and that's how it began. And I would just like kind of like consciously look at my parents, photograph them, and see, I guess, the humanity in them. But also just document them while I still can. Because I was really scared, COVID was gonna, catch one of us and we'll pass away. It caught my grandpa, which was really scary. Um, so just like documenting these moments and, down the line, I think it would do like a great good for me, my sister, and also the rest of my family to look back on like, you know, these memories that we might have forgotten or these moments of like who they were. and things like that. But yeah, I think that is the essence of the project. It's just like capturing love, and in some other senses, also like the Asian American identity. And I'm trying to dig deeper into that aspect of like I'm still continuing it in some ways of putting into color work, but also focusing on, culture, tradition, and like trying to go back to Vietnam and photograph where they were born and from. And yeah.
Would you say that you learned new things about your family or got closer with them throughout the process?
Oh yeah, for sure. Like they're very like reserved people. Like they wouldn't tell you about, their life unless you asked them. Well, my mom would tell, me and my sister about her life a lot. Um, but I've kind of like tried to dig deeper in terms of like asking my family, like, oh, your childhood, your things like that, your upbringings, and also, about our extended family because I wanted to try to include them as well. So definitely like deepening the bond between me and my family and my parents especially. Um, and having them kind of take me in as, a person observing their life, but also as like a loved one. Because some at the beginning of the project, they felt like they had to smile for the camera, feel very posed. But eventually they kind of saw me as like a fly on the wall, just like they're just like capturing whatever they're doing and, just being a bit more candid about things. Yeah.
Um, so for both of the projects that we just talked about, what was the how long did it take you to create each of those projects?
Yeah. So I think for Queer Journey, it took a year because it was like a 2 semester long project to produce. Um, for Queer Journey, it's still ongoing in some sense, but the book and exhibition was made within 2 to 3 years. Yeah.
Um, did you for the second one, did you mean Queer Journey or do you mean the second project? You said that Queer Journey was ongoing or was is your family's project still ongoing?
Oh yeah, the family project's still ongoing. Yeah, yeah,
Oh, okay. I
yeah.
thought
So
yeah,
Queer
that's what
Journey took only a year. Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
yeah, that's what I
Okay.
thought you meant. Okay, yeah. Um, sorry about that. Why did you choose to be based in Houston rather than New York, Chicago, San Francisco, LA, all those places?
Yeah. Well, Houston has always been home, so I'm like a bit more familiar with the area. Um, but also New York is hella expensive. Oh my gosh. Let me tell you, like I have a friend who lives there. She pays like 3,500 for her room, and she has three other roommates. I was like, damn, and it's small compared to it's like the size of my room right now. And I was just like, oh gosh, I might as well live in Houston, with my family. Um, and I remember staying at my friend's for a week in New York. And it was just like very cramped, very busy, very in a hurry. And I was like, it's not for me, or at least not yet. I remember when I was younger, I was like, oh, I'm gonna be a famous photographer living in New York with a studio. And I'm like, yeah, that's a pipe dream now because money's kind of tight. So I kind of right now I'm based in Houston, so I'm trying to like discover the art community here, the Asian community here, and things like that, and do like projects surrounding community, family here, which is good. I think Houston's developing in the art world really well. Um, the Houston Contemporary Photography Center, um, and a bunch of like also like art nonprofits that I'm trying to like participate in. But the art scene here in Houston is very rich in terms of diversity, and the artists you meet here have so many, great ideas. So I think I made the right choice of like staying in Houston for a bit at least, just so I could connect with community, stay close to family, and save money at least.
Yeah, you actually just answered the question I was gonna ask. I was gonna ask, what the photography scene is like in Houston. So I guess to ask a question going off of that, what kinds of photography are most popular in Houston?
Yeah. Um, let's see. Um, I guess a big one would be like, portrait and like wedding photographers. They always make good money because, everyone's having weddings, and things like that. Um, I think that's community I see on Facebook. Because I'm a part of like a couple of Facebook photography groups, and that's things I see are like weddings, portraits, lifestyle, um, fashion, and things like that. Um, in terms of the fine art world, there is a big fine art scene, I believe, in Houston. I'm just trying to like find it and dig into it. Yeah.
So, what techniques do you use the most and or which do you prefer? Is it um digital photography that you stick to? Do you dabble in film? Yeah.
Yeah. Um, During college, I used a lot of film cameras, and for the family project, that was mainly film, and I started mixing in black and white digital photography. Um, and the sake of money, money's gonna be big. I don't do so much film anymore. I'm mostly focused on digital because with a digital camera you can take like unlimited photos, delete it, retake a bunch of photos. So you save compared to film, where you have to buy rolls on rolls and then also send it off to get developed. Um, you save a lot of money. So nowadays I only stick with digital photography.
Just curious, what was the first camera you ever had?
Yeah. Oh, okay. The first camera I had specifically was like a Nikon D3300. Um, yeah, it was like a beginner DSLR camera that I got after birthday because I told my mom, like being a graphic designer is cool and all, but I want to try photography when back in high school. So she got it for me, and that was the first camera I got. And I remember the first picture I took was through the mirror of me and my mother when she showed me the box. And I was like, oh, just remembering that now. Yeah.
So, going off of that, what do you like to photograph the most?
What I like to photograph the most. Definitely people. I consider myself as like a portrait photographer. Um, and like just like photographing people has always been nice. Well, nice, but also it's a great experience for me in terms of like learning new people, being more social with people. I consider myself like an ambivert, like both extroverted and introverted at times. So I've been using photography as a way of like meeting people, photographing strangers, friends, and kind of like learning more about their lives. Like as I'm like photographing your portrait, I would ask questions like, oh, find out things that we might relate in, things that you like to do. Um, so I think using photography and photographing people as a means of like getting to know the person is like a tool I use. Um, and I find photographing people very fun for me. Like, you get to see details that, you wouldn't see in the face or like aspects of their life. Like I try to photograph very authentically and candidly about people's lives and like photographing what you like to do. And I also work kind of as like a photojournalist, kind of, like photographing for like newspapers and things like that, photographing for news stories. Um, and it has really taught me like how to look at people and interview them and like how to photograph them for public for the public to see. So how do you get that story out there about someone when you've only met them for like a few minutes? But yeah.
Being an ambivert, Do you like collaboration or do you prefer working alone?
Um, let's see, being introvert. I don't know. I find like photography is like kind of lonely sometimes. Um, like it's hard to well, in some sense it is collaborative because it's like you and also like the person you're photographing. Um, so I guess in that sense it's very collaborative and I find it enjoyable in that aspect. Some of the aspects that I don't like is like, like scheduling, finding time to photograph each other, um, and things like that. But in terms of like being an introvert, it's nice. Like I think my extrovert side definitely sticks out a bit more when I'm like photographing people and like trying to get to know people. Um, the inch when that's all and done, I get tired and just like recluse myself to my room and edit the photos. And I guess it's like my introvert comes in and just put on some good jams and just make fun edits. Yeah.
Mhm. You touched on this a bit, um, but what is your mission as an artist? Or in other words, what do you want your art to communicate to its viewer?
Yeah. I guess let's see. I guess the essence of my art is to photograph and explore the themes of community, home, um, yeah, community, home, relationships, and just like people in general. Like I find myself very interested in learning about people's lives, their upbringings, and you know, exploring the many identities that I have, like being queer, being Asian American, um, being like a very family oriented person. Um, so like just like um looking at those identities that I have and exploring it a bit more through photography. For example, like photographing the queer community on my campus, um, photographing my family, and like just like photographing for like news outlets and like trying to learn more about the community. Um, but that's like my main mission, I believe, for my art.
In an previous interview, you said you're drawn to explore the relationships between people, community, identity, and culture. So, what exactly is it in these relationships that you find most compelled to explore?
Like which one out of those?
Or what about the relationships between people, community, identity, and culture? Like, what about it is so interesting to you? What do you think that you can capture in your art relating to that?
Oh, okay, okay. I guess like let's see. I guess what's most fascinating is like in my terms as a photographer is like listening to people's stories, um, and learning about it. And how do I portray that fascination, like um, this peak of interest to the world, through a photograph. So it's basically my job to, relay that story to other people. Um, so I think, does that answer your question? I can't tell, but um, yeah, just like finding ways to like showing the world my interest in these subjects to the world through photography. Um, yeah.
I think another way to rephrase it to expand on the question, um, like, oh, I just forgot what I was going to say. We'll come back to that once I remember it. I promise that I will.
Okay, no worries.
Um, okay, so do you feel like you have a responsibility to fulfill as a queer Vietnamese American artist? Does the responsibility feel heavy or even a burden at times in your work?
Hmm. I guess with that question in mind, I guess I'm still trying to answer that as I'm starting this new project which is like Queer Journey except focusing um queer Asian folks in Houston. So I'm trying to work out. Well, right now I'm just like photographing like queer Asian friends that I have and like getting their narrative and their portraits done. And I'm hoping to expand it to the greater Houston community. Um, and as I'm talking to folks and like asking them if they would, take part in this project, there is definitely a sense of pushback, because like some people aren't out yet, um, to like either their parents or to friends and things like that. So they're very closeted still, and um, they're not sure if they want to, put themselves through this project because they don't know where it's going to go and things like that. Um, so I guess being Asian and queer is definitely very hard. It's like two worlds that can't really, you know, happen or be in. Like at some moments I find myself, conflicted between like my Asian identity and also my queer identity. Cause, in some sense you can't really exist in Asian aspects in culture or, you're a burden. Um, but yeah.
Do you feel artistic burnout? And if so, how do you overcome it?
Yeah, I think I feel artistic burnout quite a lot. Cause like I'm like Cause like I'm as I said before, like I'm trying to prove to my parents, that my art career is sustainable. I can make a living like this. Um, and I find myself like challenging myself a lot in terms of like making work, pushing it out there, trying to get grants and things like that. And it's competitive. And I find myself burning out a lot. Um, and how I recover is like kind of like stepping away from the camera or the computer and just like enjoying time with like friends, walking, I don't know, go kayaking and things like that. And I was going to an idea, but I totally lost it. It was but yeah, I think that's I hope that answers your question.
No, for sure it does. Um, what have been your proudest accomplishments in your artistic career thus far, and what do you hope to do in the future?
Oh, okay. Let's see. Proudest moment was definitely when I had my senior exhibition back in college. That was like the first moment my work was hanged in a museum, and it was so nice to work with the museum to, bring my vision to life and show off the project that I've been working on for like 2, 3 years. And also like showing it to my family at the museum because it was like their first time seeing it as a book and also like framed on the wall. And that is my proudest moment. And for the future, I put like high goals on myself, just like to keep pushing me out there. Like definitely get a solo exhibition at like MoMA or like these big museums eventually. Have my photo book published by like a big publisher, like Aperture or something like that. And also like photographing for like Vogue magazine, Vanity Fair, and like their cover or something. So those are like some of my goals. Yeah.
What are your views on making a profit in the arts? Meaning, how do you balance appropriately pricing pieces while also maintaining accessibility?
Ooh, that is a very deep question. Let's see. Um, I think there definitely has to be a balance between accessibility, but also like making a profit. Um, because you don't want to undersell your work. Because that just, determines the value of you as an artist. But also, valuing something like super high is just like crazy enough because no one's gonna want to buy it and it's just gonna sit there. Um, and in terms of accessibility, having it in some form where like you can give out to people is also really nice because I think that's something I'm trying to work on as well in um as an artist. I find great fascination in photo books because they're they don't they can belong in a museum, but at the same time, they're a book, so they belong on people's shelves, libraries that anybody can almost like access. Um, so compared to like a museum environment where like people need admission to get in, you have to work with a curator in that museum in order to hang your work and everything. I find the book form very beautiful in terms of like giving it to people, very accessible. Um, and it's like a museum in a book, you can curate it yourself, put pictures here and there. Um, yeah.
So, do you think art goes underappreciated on the internet and or social media when it's accessible to the public or free? What are your thoughts on that?
Hmm. I think I might be biased because I'm in an art bubble. Because like, people value photographs and things like that. Um, Especially I've been eyeing this one Instagram page which focuses on New York Times and their print newspapers. Um, and the value of like freelance photographers, and like if you remove it from like the newspaper, it would just be like text and not so much anything else. Um, in terms of like, sorry, can you repeat your question one more time? Sorry.
Of course, of course. Um, because you were mentioning the possible like underappreciation of art when it's not priced or correctly, or um you were just saying that like artists can undersell themselves, and so I was thinking that when art is quote unquote free on the internet and or social media, do you think it can be underappreciated?
Oh, okay. Um, Free artworks on the internet. Would you consider that like an Instagram photograph or
It can be anything. I was just
okay.
asking in general.
Yeah, yeah. I think because I have a hard time defining like what a free picture is. So I'm gonna just like kind of describe that as like photographs you could like find online and things like that. Um, I think there's value in every art piece and photograph that people make. It's just up to the person, like the public, the audience, but also as the artist to value that work. um so like just finding that balance between of how to price yourself in terms of like the public eye but also like your eye. You might value yourself like really highly, but people might just see you as like one in a million, or just like within a million other artists that do like the same line of work. Um so um I think there's like very a lot of hidden gems out there in people's photographs, and when artists see that it's gathering a large audience, then that should in some sense make the artist feel very valuable and raise their value and things like that. So it's like a relationship between the artist and the audience in terms of value.
Who are some of your favorite photographers? And do you model your style based on others, or do you like developing a style of your own?
Yeah, I have a lot of photographers that I follow. I actually have two lists, which are like dead and alive photographers. Um, but let's see. I Some of the photographers that I follow today are like Annie Leibovitz, and some like the greats are like Richard Avedon. I'm blanking out. Um, Well, I guess also some of the other photographers that I follow today, that are, Asian, just like me, and also like in the art industry, are like Justin, I think Justin J. Wee, and well, there's a couple of photographers out there that I follow. I just need to pull up that list. Um, but I find myself looking to their works as inspiration. I remember back in college, I would like pull out a whole collection of photo books and just like trying to see through their eye of what they see in their subjects or like through people. It's like seeing how they photograph people and like trying to mimicking that, but also trying to give my own style to it, in terms of like who do I photograph, how do I photograph them, um, and things like that. So I'm definitely inspired by, photographers and the great portrait photographers out there. But I'm always constantly trying to get inspired by them and try to give my own creative swing to it. But yeah.
On a different note, uh, this is sort of a deeper question, but do you believe that all art should have a purpose?
Hmm. My first response is no. Um, I feel like art can just be, for the heck of it. It doesn't need to have a purpose, like I don't know, someone drew a stick figure. Does it have to have a purpose? It's just there. Um, but I think people can give art a purpose, like you can make it without a purpose, but someone else might find relevance in it and then give it a purpose. So um yeah, that's my answer for that. So art doesn't necessarily have to have a purpose, but inherently it can gain a purpose, I guess.
In addition to being a Houston-based editorial and portrait photographer, it appears you're a sort of multimedia artist. Like alongside some of your photography projects and publications, you write as well. So I wanted to ask, what is your writing artistic process like compared to your photography artistic process?
Wait, I write? I didn't know I wrote.
Or there's just some written pieces, whether it's just explaining what your work means. I mean, it's well written, so I assume that you had artistic interest in writing.
Yeah, I guess I dabbled a little bit into I think poetry is very beautiful, low key. Um, that little short phrase that I put in my family project of like kind of like my father's a handyman. He's oh gosh, I can't remember it. But like that little excerpt, that came from the heart when I was writing like my artist statement. Um, so I think the things that you were looking at were like artist statements where I spent like a lot of time of like how do I describe this work to people and how do I express my feelings as an artist into it? Um, and specifically looking at my family project, I think poetry is a beautiful way of like expressing yourself, if not through imagery, through words, very poetically and almost like artistically as well. Um, so yeah, I never considered myself as a writer, because I always have grammar troubles and things like that. So, but yeah, thank you.
What are your insights on Asian American representation in photography or further in the visual art scene? And or what are your hopes for the future?
In terms of Asian American photographers in the art scene, we could use more of it, heck a lot more. Because I think in history it's like very white dominant. So more Asian photographers is always great. We all have different perspectives, and it's nice to bring that in, especially through the BIPOC community. We need more BIPOC photographers, covering events, covering their stories, and making art. Because a lot as the world becomes more diverse, especially like U.S., also Houston, having more diverse based art is great because people can relate to it, express themselves, and tell their story. I think that's the main form of how I use my art to tell my own story, and it should be like that for other artists and what inspires them.
Great. You mentioned this when discussing your college experience, but how did the COVID-19 pandemic affect your field?
Yeah, so I was still in school at that time, and when COVID hit, at that time, I believe I was like still trying to figure out my situation to go abroad, um, handling my classes and things like that. So when I got the announcement that, our school would be shutting down, everyone would need to go home and things like that, it came in really fast, and I'm still like trying to process of like what happened during those times because it's a bit of like a blur. Um, but basically, I couldn't go study abroad anymore. COVID shut down everything. I got sent home back to Houston, and um, class would be resuming over Zoom, and that's that's what happened during most of the time during like January through like May of that last semester of college. Um, and that's when like it was almost like I was encouraged to do a project about my family because like the feelings of like losing them because of COVID, or it gave me that passion to photograph them during that time. So um yeah.
Okay, we're gonna move into community involvement now. I can't remember the question I was gonna ask. Um, the question where I was talking about the relationships between people, community, identity, and culture. I'm so sorry. It just has been that
Yeah,
kind
no,
of
no, don't
day.
worry about it. I remember it was like something about like what was the one thing interesting about it, or something that you want to like try to capture through photography or something like that.
Yeah,
Um,
something like
yeah.
that. But it's just been that kind of day. So we'll go ahead and move forward.
Yeah,
Maybe.
don't worry about it.
Right. Okay, so you are or have been involved with the National Press Photographer Association, Diversify Photo Up Next, and the Asian American Journalists Association. Can you speak on your experiences with them?
Yeah. Um, well, I'm fresh out of college, so I just like recently joined those. But so far it's been great. Let's see. With NPPA, I've joined their mentorship program, which connected me with like a professional photographer who could help me, advance me into my next career stages as a photographer. And that has been great working with Jared Soares, who's an amazing like portrait photographer that uh this other photographer connect me with. Um, so he's been like critiquing my work and like kind of like how to propel myself further in my career. So I'm very grateful for that, for Jared, for MPPA, and my friend Marie who connected me with Jared. Um, and let's see, with the Asian American Journalism Association, um, um, it's been American journalists like producing work and also the stories that they represent. I hope to be more involved with them eventually down the line. I just haven't had a chance to like connect to the Houston cohort. Um, and with Diversify Photo, I'm a big fan of them. They represent, the BIPOC photographers and artist community around the US and also like greater around the world. Um, but it's a great not company, a great hmm, like society to be in because like it represents a lot. And I've met a lot of great people through Diversify Photo, photo editors, friends, photographers, um, and just like learning from them and just knowing that we're a part of this community that, does good to, the photo industry. Yeah.
On a side note, we'll come back to community involvement right after this question, but just because I'm curious, because I have almost no involvement in photography, um, you were talking about you've mentioned about like your mentor critiquing you or helping you. What exactly um does your photography professor or mentor help you with in terms of photography when they're critiquing or giving you advice? Do they help clarify your purpose um or like story you want to be told in that specific piece, or is it more technical? um yeah, just generally speaking, what does critique mean in photography?
Yeah. I think it's all of those above. Yeah. Um, it's all of those above, like in terms of like how do you want to proceed forward with your art career in terms of like like technical issues, with your camera or with the programs you're using, or how to do a certain a technique better, like how to produce a better photo, how to better light something. So your professor or like mentor can help you in that aspect. Um, but also how to better develop the story that you're trying to photograph, in terms of like how to connect to this community better. Can they connect? Can your mentor connect you to other people who might have like a better insight to this story? Um, and also they're also there to help challenge you a bit more, like how can you photograph this person in a better light in terms of like what they're going through or what they're trying to tell you. Um, and also trying to dive deeper into people's stories. Sometimes you just like cover the surface of like people's backgrounds and people's narratives. But there's also like deeper things that you can dive into if the subject allows it, like people's traumas, people's hardships, and how to get access to those stories, and um, being allowing the subject to be vulnerable with you as the photographer. Yeah.
Okay, great. That totally answered my question. Um, Getting back to
Okay.
community involvement, have you always found community involvement to be important?
Yeah, I think right now I find community involvement really important in terms of like connecting with other photographers and photo editors, and like trying to build a network to connect people with, and like get jobs, find assignments and things like that. Um in terms of like photographing the community, I'm trying to connect with the Houston community in terms of like finding people to photograph for this Asian queer project. So it's definitely a work in progress, and hopefully, it goes up.
Have you gotten involved with the Vietnamese or Vietnamese American communities in Houston?
Yeah, I've been trying to. It don't from during my college years, like 4 years away from Houston and coming back now, it feels like I'm trying to like reconnect with the um Houston side of the world a bit more. So it's definitely been a work in progress. I've been trying to. I know on my Instagram page, I've followed like a bunch of like Vietnamese based organizations, and also eyeing communities that or organizations that I could better connect with. Like I'm slowly reaching out to some like their events coordinators and like trying to go to their events to learn more about, their organizations and what they do and how I can help out, like how I can, help with their services or like with their events and volunteer. I think volunteering is something I've been really excited to do in terms of like helping the photo community, but also like the Vietnamese community as well. Yeah.
What are your insights on the Vietnamese or Vietnamese American communities in Houston? What do you see for the future of these communities in Houston and further in America, even?
Yeah. I think I see it growing for sure. I think it's very crucial to the world and our community today. Um, as we learn to adapt. Um, in some sense, I find it almost fading. Maybe it's just me, but at the same time, I find my Vietnamese identity almost fading because I'm taking in American ways more so than my Vietnamese ways. So I find myself trying to rediscover that Vietnamese identity, and I was gonna try to dive further into that by going back to going to Vietnam for the first time because I've never visited Vietnam before, and try to reconnect with like my parents' background. Um, I think the Asian American community will always be there and continue to grow. It's just that I feel like my generation, maybe it's just me, or maybe other people feel as well, is that we're losing that identity a little bit, and we're clutching onto it. Yeah.
As a queer Asian American, do you find the Houston community supportive? Bleh. And what can Houston do to better show its support?
Yeah, I think hmm I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I'm pretty sure there are like queer Asian communities here in Houston, but I just haven't found it yet. But in terms of a sense of my friends and like their queer experience, it's definitely more sheltered in some ways. It's very internal. Um, so like parents don't really understand the definition of queer. Um, but I do feel some sense that they're trying to, understand it, that this is the way we live now. Um, and yeah, I think there is a strong sense of like an Asian queer community in Houston, I believe. I just need to find it. And that tight sense of bonding. Because I know one person I photographed recently, she found a queer community within rock climbing, and there's a large Asian following as well. So that's nice. Yeah.
In what ways do you think arts or even photography can help bridge the differences of the multicultural community of Houston?
Yeah, I think arts is beneficial regardless of developing community, developing story, developing people's narratives, It I think when people say pictures are worth like 1,000 words, I think that's true in terms of like expressing the artist's feelings, but also like their backgrounds and their story of like who they are, and what communities they're trying to connect with. So I think arts will only exemplify, community building and connecting multi-generational, multicultural, and the diversity of like Houston and the world.
Great. Before heading into our conclusion questions, this is just a general question that we've been asking. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been an uptick in anti-Asian hate crimes. And so I just wanted to gather your thoughts and or experiences on this.
Yeah, I think when I first heard about that, it was very scary because I was at Kobe at the time and in college, and when I heard about it, I got very scared for my parents for sure, because my my mom runs a small business, and and people might break into her store, or people might rob her. So I got really scared, and also for my dad and my grandparents and my aunts and uncles, because they're also local business owners, and you know um so I was really scared for them when you know I think the hashtag was like hashtag stop Asian hate, and it was like very strong, and I got really scared for them. I remember calling them like almost like weekly, like 3 times a week, just to make sure everything was all right at home and things like that. Um, so I was very worried for them. But I knew they were like almost safe within the Houston community because they live in like A-Leaf, and which is like predominantly Asian, so they had each other's back. But I couldn't help but worry. Yeah.
Of course, that's totally understandable. Okay, so heading into our last questions of this interview, um, what local spots do you recommend in Houston?
Local spots in Houston. Um, let's see. Just like any local spot, like restaurants and or
Oh yeah, it can be like literally anything.
oh, anything. Oh my gosh. Gosh. What's that place in Rice Village with the hot dogs like that won't be there anymore?
Yo-Yo's hot dogs, but actually I think it's moving onto Rice's campus now.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's good to hear. Wait, so do we have to be a student in order to get in there?
I'm not actually sure. I think that was my concern too. I'm not sure about that. I hope it's open to the public.
Yeah, okay. If it's open to the public, then I recommend there because I remember standing in line for those, and those are really good. Um, but I guess Bel Air Chinatown is always nice, and I know Katie's getting an Asian town too, which is really nice as well. They're both really amazing places to try foods, drinks, and things like that. Yeah. anywhere there is good, I hope.
Okay, yeah, we're down to our last two questions. What do you wish to accomplish in the upcoming years? What are your short-term goals and long-term goals?
Well, long-term growth, I already like kind of told you about, getting a solo exhibit, getting a book published, and working with like a high-end magazine or something. Short-term goals, gosh, it's only February and I'm like slowly breaking my New Year's resolution. um, of trying to like stay healthy and things like that, health, um, also, continuing to drive my creative passion, but also, try not to burn myself out, like, yeah. Um, but yeah, those are, I think staying healthy is definitely like a big short-term goal of like mental health, but also, physical health and yeah.
And our last question, what do you want to be remembered for? This can be as an artist, as an individual, or I mean, maybe they're both the same. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Let's see. What do I want on my obituary or gravestone, basically? Let's see. Well, I hope my family recognizes. I mean, remembers me as like a very caring person, like a very family orientated son. Hopefully my friends remember me as a caring person. Or as that photographer guy, I don't know. Um, and to the greater world, hopefully a photographer that took great passion into photographing people authentically and um you know yeah, photographing things that he enjoys and things that he finds passions in, a person that listens to the people who he photographs and um like lets them be heard. um yeah, I don't know what to put on my tombstone though. Probably like the day I was born and died and stuff like that.
Okay, awesome. Um, do you have anything else you would like to add? Those are all the questions from me. And again, thank you so much for providing such detailed and comprehensive answers to those questions. I understand that those questions can be sort of difficult to answer on the spot, but you did it gracefully.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Anything else I would add? Um, well, that's like really close to the question I would ask like people I would interview. Like, is there anything else? Is there anything else you want me to know that I didn't ask? And it's always like eye-opening to hear what people say. Um, I don't know. I think you asked all the good questions that are about me and my life. But yeah, hopefully, great.
Great. Thank you so much for participating in this interview with me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gina.